Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tim Barton.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to be with you. I want to take you on a bit of a journey through American history. And ultimately, as we are getting ready to celebrate 250 years of our nation, this is a really big deal. I'm going to have a bunch of images behind me, by the way. It's going to look way better than that guy on the screen you're looking at. So as we celebrate 250 years as a nation, most Americans have actually not been very prepared to understand why this is as special as it actually is. And so I want to walk you through some of the details of why we actually should be more excited than probably most Americans are. Let me start with the fact, first of all, that there was a study done years ago, professors who said, hey, America, we've kind of been around for a while, but our Constitution is actually pretty old. And they asked a pretty simple question. They said, what is the average length of a Constitution in world history? And they went back through more than 5,000 years of recorded human history, all available resources. And this was done, by the way, you can look it up online if you want to. It was the University of Chicago. It was their law school. And what they discovered is that in the history of the world, the length of an average constitution is 17 years. Now, I want to offer you some perspective, because this year we celebrate 250 years as a nation. That's from the Declaration. The Constitution was written 11 years later. But our Constitution this year is 239 years old. We are the longest lasting ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world, and it's not even close. Let me go further. Because as some of these professors, who actually most of them not conservative or Christian, but they were intellectually curious. And they said, well, what then, if the Constitution has lasted so long, what then was it that made this so different? So actually it was a professor named Donald Luss from the University of Houston who led this study. And his question was, where did the founding fathers come up with these ideas they put in the Constitution that's made the Constitution work so well for so long? And his idea was, let's go back and review their writings. And in their writings specifically, let's look for any time they quote somebody, because if we find quotations, we can go back and look up the original source. If we find the original source, then we'll know who they're reading. We'll see who influenced them. This was his idea. He said, okay, let's go and let's start from like 1760, but before the Stamp Act, and let's go all the way through past the Bill of Rights. That's the time frame they're looking in. His idea was initially to find 15,000 original writings. Now, it's also worth noting that he's doing this was back in the 1980s. And many of you in the room remember, research used to be a little different back in the 1980s when there was no internet. And if you're reading 15,000 representative writings they were going to read through. And so, for example, they're going to read a George Washington letter, and they're like, he quoted somebody. Well, who did he quote? And so this professor took his grad students, got some other professors to help. They went to the local library on campus, and they said, all right, students, everybody get a book, start reading, let me know when you find this quote. That's the worst idea ever, given modern technology. That does not sound fun at all. They did this, and in the midst of going through 15,000 writings, they did this every time they found a quote. They ended up discovering the origins of 3,154 quotes, and it took them a little over 10 years to do it. This is a committed research team, lots of grad students along the way, but what they did is release their book. It was called The Origins of American Constitutionalism. It is still a great book. It's still considered the most scholarly work ever on this topic. And what they discovered is the number one cited individual among the founding fathers was a guy named Charles Montesquieu. He did the Spirit of the Laws. And Montesquieu, very influential, separation of powers, lots of thoughts from him came to the founding fathers. But then you have guys like William Blackstone. He was the second most quoted among the founding fathers. And he did obviously the Commentaries on the Laws of England, but he really shaped a lot of the framework of the legal ideas in America. The third most cited individual was a guy named John Locke. John Locke did the 2 treatises of government. He's the guy that came up with life, liberty, and property. Very influential, but these historians noted he actually was really quoted during the American Revolution, not very much after that. Those are the top 3 cited individuals. And to these professors' surprise, the most quoted source, not an individual, the most quoted source was the Bible. 34% of all of the quotes they found came from the Bible. But let me go further, because what they identified, he said, look, we have to operate in parameters, right? You have to have the parameters so that you can have this good academic study. And so our parameters were what was in quotation marks. He acknowledged, he said, as we were reading these writings, they talked about the Bible all the time. There were so many obvious references from their letters from the Bible that were not in quotation marks. He said, had we included all of the obvious references not in quotation marks, the number would have been far higher than 34%. I can attest, not only would it have been over 40%, it's probably well over 50%, knowing how often the founding fathers quoted the Bible and never put it in quotation marks. But here's the reason I say that. Because if we look back today, the founding fathers that gave us the most free, the most stable, the most prosperous nation in the history of the world, the idea that it's been academically confirmed that the most influential source in their life was the Bible, that seems very unusual in the modern context narrative. Well, let me go a little deeper. Let's do a deeper cut on this, because if you go back to earlier generations, not only was this far more common knowledge, but there's other things they knew that we too have forgotten. So for example, Alice Baldwin, she was a professor at Duke University. She actually started the women's program at Duke University. She was there in the 1930s, the 1940s, and 1950s. And Alice Baldwin, in 1928, she wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. Now, her book is available online. You can get a reprint, or you actually can just read it online digitally. I would highly encourage you to do this, but if you don't have time to read the whole thing, go online, look up this book, and go to her conclusion. It's like 170 pages is the book. There's a 5-page conclusion on the end, and she summarizes all the thoughts. Even if you just read the 5-page conclusion, it would be very informative for you. And one of the things that she acknowledges, that she already laid out in the book, she says, when you look at the Declaration, she said there was not a right asserted in the Declaration which had not been preached from American pulpits prior to 1763. And what she explains is the founding fathers actually didn't come up with a single unique idea. They repeated what they had been learning from their pastors for decades leading up to the moment. And then, by the way, at the end of her conclusion, she has an appendix. The appendix is the title of the pastor and the clause of the sermon that has the right from the Declaration. She literally puts the receipts in the end of the book. So when people today are like, no, the founding fathers weren't religious, I just want to point out, not only was the number one cited source in their writings the Bible, the most influential source was the Bible, the most influential voice for the founding fathers was their pastors. Today, we don't learn this, but I'm just telling you, like, this is historically confirmed and documented. And this is something, if you go back, again, earlier historians like Bishop Charles Galloway, he wrote a book in 1898 talking about the influence of Christianity in the formation of America. But he identified it was because of the pastors that America was birthed and that this influence of Christianity happened. Here's the way he described the pastors. He said, mighty men they were, men of iron nerve and strong hand and unblanched cheek and heart of flame. God needed not reed shaken by the wind, nor men clothed in soft raiment, but heroes of hardihood and lofty courage. And such were the sons of the mighty who responded to the divine call. Now, he actually goes on and tells their stories, but let me just walk you really quickly through a couple of history nuggets and connect some dots that we probably haven't been taught unless you've been listening to like the Federers or the Bartons for very long. So if you go back when Paul Revere makes his famous midnight ride, April 19th, 1775, we generally have this idea he's riding to warn the Americans the British are coming. Well, that's kind of true, but not totally. He wasn't just riding to warn arbitrarily the Americans. He was actually riding to Lexington, to Concord, because that's where the British were going. And then to go further, he was actually riding to specifically warn John Hancock and Sam Adams that they needed to get out of town. Why? Because the British had released an order, and specifically in the order, it says, our business was to seize a quantity of military stores and the bodies of Mr. Hancock and Adams. The king was like, hey, these are the two rebel rousers. If we get these guys, we might can shut this whole thing down. So Paul Revere literally is riding to warn these two guys. He gets to Lexington. Well, where is he going to find these two guys? Well, he rode to the home of the Reverend Jonas Clark. Now, why would he do that? Because the Reverend Jonas Clark was a mentor of John Hancock and Sam Adams, who, by the way, were there that night. So he rides to the house. He tells them, guys, you got to get out of town. Well, the next morning is when you have the shot heard around the world. This is when you have roughly 800 British against a little more than 80 Americans who are there. When we hear about the shot heard around the world, it's on Lexington Green. The green was the front yard of the church. That was the grass in front of the church. The 80 men that opposed the British were all members of his church. It literally was the church at Lexington telling the British, you can't have our guns and gunpowder, and we're not turning over Hancock and Adams. Okay? After the British leave, they go to Concord Bridge. Well, at Concord Bridge, the militia that's there to rally them, well, guess who raised that militia? Well, that's the Reverend William Emerson, the pastor at Concord. The British then go bottom left. They're marching on the road back to Boston. It's estimated 4,000 to 5,000 Americans actually met them and opposed them on the road back to Boston. And interestingly enough, these militias, many of them, if not the majority of them, were actually led, not just rallied, led by their pastor to go stop the British, who at this point had already been firing into Americans. And then you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. Again, you have guys like Joseph Willard, who raised a full company who was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. It's just fascinating. When we look back at early America, we hear about the battles, but because we don't know the story of the people involved or where the men came from, there's a disconnect for us of the role the church actually literally played in the forming of this nation. But let me go further, because when word gets out of what's happening in Boston and Americans go, okay, well, we want to do something, it's quite fascinating how many people start to rally their troops to start moving that direction. You have, for example, the Reverend David Avery, who got 20 parishioners to sign up to start taking steps to go help defend the Americans. The Reverend Stephen Farrar from New Hampshire led 97 parishioners. Joseph Willard, he raised 2 full companies. You have John Steele, he got 900 men from his town. And if you have 900 men that is part of your church back then, that's a mega church today. Like back then, that is a huge church. Well, again, so this is a pastor, but then you have other pastors as well that are raising people to get involved. I'm gonna tell you in a minute, one of my favorite stories is the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He also raised a regiment out of his church, but I'm gonna come to him in a second. What's interesting is you have guys, and actually Graham Allen mentioned this morning about the Black Robe Regiment. There were 2 names given to pastors who were part of the cause back then. They were known as Fighting Parsons or the Black Robe Regiment. You can look both of those titles up and you can learn more about these guys, but an easy example is the Reverend James Caldwell. The Reverend James Caldwell was offered the military commission to be the commander of all of the forces from New Jersey. He turned it down. He said, I want to be a pastor. I don't really feel qualified. And they said, but you're the best recruiter. So if you're the guy, he said, well, I'll still recruit for you. Like I'll tell everybody to show up, but I just want to be the pastor. So one of the elders from his church became the commanding officer of all the forces there in New Jersey. And so they're doing operations, they're marching and moving, and then every Sabbath, he's leading church service. One of the more famous battles, the Battle of Springfield, as this happens, and this is by his home, the men in the militia, and actually at this point there's Continental Army primarily there too, but the Americans run out of wadding for their muskets. And back then you would pour your powder in, drop your ball in, you have a wadding, and you would ram it down with a ramrod, and that would hold everything together so that when you fired, it fired the way it should. If you don't have wadding, your gun's not going to fire properly. And when they ran out of wadding, he told the group of men, follow me, and he ran to the church. And he went into church and he got a stack full of hymn books. The hymn books he got were Isaac Watts hymn books, famous hymn writer back in the day. And he came out with these Isaac Watts hymn books, and he comes out and holds one up, and his famous line was, he said, let's give them Watts, boys, put Watts into them. They start distributing hymn books and they use it as wadding to fight back. Well, as this unfolds, because he was known as an outspoken leader, his house got targeted. And there was a British detachment that went to his house and they opened fire on his house. He's not there, but his wife and kids were. His wife was killed. His kids were still inside, and the British set fire to the house with the kids inside. One of the neighbors runs over and is able to rescue the kids so they don't burn alive. But at this point, like, it's very clear, he has a target on his head. He's one of the guys going, man, if we can take out that guy, we can end this whole thing. And so he started carrying 2 pistols with him everywhere he went. What is remarkable is there are multiple historic accounts that he would get up in his pulpit on Sunday. He'd open his Bible. He would then draw a pistol and put it on one side. He would draw a pistol, put it on the other side. He looked at the audience and said, the British will not stop me from preaching, but they are welcome to try. This is the caliber of the pastors who were leading the movement. Well, let me give you another one. This is probably my favorite. John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He was a pastor in Woodstock, Virginia, but he also was a member of the state legislature, and the state legislature met in Williamsburg. Now, already let that sink in. It was a pastor who was also a state legislature, because pastors didn't used to think you can't be involved in government and politics, okay? So he's literally a state legislator. In January 1776, the British come to town. They do the same thing they did in Lexington and Concord. They take all the guns and gunpowder. Patrick Henry's there. He leads this group of 5,000 farmers to get all their stuff back. But Patrick Henry, as this happens, he says, hey, war is not just in Massachusetts. Now it's in Virginia. We need to go raise our militia. So he tells all of the delegates, go back and raise militias in your hometown. Well, John Peter Muhlenberg is a pastor. So he gets on horseback from Williamsburg. He rides over 200 miles, makes it back to Woodstock in time for Sunday service. He got up and he opened his Bible to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now back then there's an elevated pulpit. So he climbs up this elevated pulpit. He stands in the pulpit. And back then, everybody wore these black clerical robes, regardless of denomination. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is open, a time, a season, a purpose for everything under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die. He gets to verse 8. There's a time for war and a time for peace. He closed the Bible. He said, brethren, we're no longer in a time of peace. This is now a time of war. He tells them what has just happened in Williamsburg. He says, we are going to raise a militia from our town, and we're going to go fight the British. He then says, let's close in prayer. And you can imagine probably the somber nature of the audience. And they're like, what is happening right now? Right? Our pastor said we're going to war. He finished the prayer. And then what pastors would normally do, they would go off into a back room. They would take off their clerical robe. He stayed in the pulpit. And he began to disrobe in the pulpit to reveal that he was wearing the uniform of a Continental Army officer. And he stood there and let everybody take it in. He then dismounted the pulpit. He walks down, there's a middle aisle in the church. He walks down the aisle, he says, brethren, we came here, our grandparents, our parents, they came here to practice freedom. But if we won't get involved now, we will lose everything we came here to enjoy. He says, I'm going to fight to defend freedom. Who will go with me? They had a little drummer boy sign-up sheet at the back of the church. Here's what's incredible. They had 300 men get signed up at the back of his church. Here's why it's incredible. There weren't 300 men there that day. Oh, it's because there was a bunch of wives and kids who were signing their husbands and dads up who weren't there. That's probably a fun conversation later. Oh, Dad, by the way, I signed you up for the militia. No big deal. They became the 8th Virginia Brigade. Well, John Peter Muhlenberg, he actually goes on to become a major general. He's there at the end where Washington defeats Cornwallis at Yorktown. He's literally one of the generals who was there. He was there. His men were there at Valley Forge. His men are there through the whole thing of the Revolution. And his brother was also a pastor. And his brother says, dude, what are you doing? Frederick says, bro, you're totally wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. And he tells his brother, he says, I understand what you're arguing. And here's the quote. He says, I'm a clergyman, it's true, but I'm a member of society as well as the poorest layman, and my liberty is as dear to me as any man. Shall I then sit still? Heaven forbid it. I'm convinced it's my duty to do so and duty I owe to God and my country. His brother said, pastors shouldn't get involved. And he said, you've misunderstood the assignment. Well, what happened is the British hadn't started doing operations in New York yet. Later that year, they did. In fact, the following summer of 1777, there were 19 churches in New York City, and this is where Frederick pastored. His church was in New York City. The British burned 10 churches to the ground. They destroyed the other 9. He watched while the British set fire to his church. When his church burned to the ground, he had an epiphany. He said, I think I need to get involved. And by the way, this is remarkable because when we separate from Great Britain, there's a lot of things happening. So the founding fathers, when we separate, they say, okay, every colony, you have to go back and write your own state constitution. It's interesting. If you go look at who actually wrote the state constitutions, in so many states, it was pastors who were the leaders of the political movement to write their state constitutions. This isn't just pastors inspiring, literally, pastors helping form their own government. Let's go further. Because when we actually have a constitution and we then have a Congress and we have a president, George Washington is there, when we actually lead up and building to having a constitution, well, how do we get there? Well, the constitution first has to be ratified. Yeah. Do you know in many states, the ratification location was actually in the churches? And actually, the people that were leading those ratification conventions were pastors. Let me go further, because when we finally do have a Constitution, then we have a Bill of Rights. On the Bill of Rights, there's only 2 signatures on the Bill of Rights. One is John Adams, the vice president. The second is actually the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Oh, that was a guy by the name of Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, the one whose church had been burned to the ground. And he's like, I need to get involved, by the way. He was joined by his brother and multiple other pastors who were members of the first Congress that actually gave us the Bill of Rights. J.T. Headley, early historian, he said, the patriotic clergy of the Revolution were the soundest statesmen of the time. Here's the thing I want to point out. If you look at all we did in America, had it not been for the role of church and early pastors, there never would have been an America. And if we don't have a resurgence of those kind of churches and pastors, there will cease to be an America. It is time for the church and pastors to raise up and start being the courageous leaders we should have been all along. God bless you guys.